Nature Solutionaries is a podcast about conservationists who do amazing things for nature and bring inspiration into our lives. In this episode, we are going to travel to the North Luangwa National Park in Zambia, one of the most untouched wilderness sanctuaries in Africa. This little-known park is home to Zambia's only black rhino population, which continues to show one of the highest growth rates in Africa. And it's also home to Zambia's largest, most stable and only increasing elephant population. But the history of the park wasn't always so rosy. The park was established in 1972, but was left unguarded and greatly suffered from poaching. In the 1980s, there were large groups of heavily armed poachers and lorries coming out of the park with hundreds of tusks, rhino horns, and bushmeat. To stop the decimation of wildlife populations, the Frankfurt Zoological Society and the Zambian Department of National Parks and Wildlife created a conservation partnership in 1986, thanks to which the North Luangwa National Park has become the safest and best maintained parks in Zambia. To learn more about this conservation success story, I invited Claire Louise, who has been working and living in the park with her husband and 3 children since 2007. Claire, welcome to Nature Solutionaries.
Thank you for having me.
Just a little note about the audio quality. Claire recorded the interview in the office in the national park, and the local buildings don't have glass in the windows. So you're going to hear wind and cicadas chirping. So I hope that you won't mind and that you will enjoy the interview anyway. Claire, I'm wondering what it was like for you to bring up 3 children in the middle of nowhere with the closest hospital very, very far away, several hours away.
Yeah, well, I guess for us it's normal, but I didn't have any other reference points, and I'd not really been around many people with children, so yeah, it's very unusual, and it's challenging and it's exciting, but I guess there's so many similarities. You still, have huge amounts of, am I doing the right thing? Are they okay? Have they got the right food? Are they, stimulated enough? Are they having enough education? And there's all those sorts of questions that every parent thinks of. But at the same time, it's sort of, don't pick up that log, there might be a scorpion in it. Don't go around that corner, there might be an elephant there. It's getting dark now, we need to go in, there's leopards around. So there's that side of things, which I guess is a little bit more unusual, but that's our life here. So it's that's our normal. But that's, I guess, no more different than crossing the road or playing on the swings in the park and falling off. There's just different dangers and risks, and it keeps us all on our toes.
While we were doing a pre-interview, you told me that somebody once wrote to you that you are the only female conservationist who has a partner, is married, and has children and works in the conservation area, right?
Well, yeah, at the time I was, going through that breastfeeding middle of the night stage, and I thought, we've got a little... our house we don't really have walls and we haven't really got windows. We're very open here. It's sort of a bit Swiss Family Robinson style, I guess is the best way to describe it for listeners. And so we did actually enclose a room so that I could feed the twins overnight. And I remember one night just, not really going very well and thinking, it's okay. There's women all over the world doing this, and it's I'm part of the sisterhood and it's fine. And then this journalist got in touch and basically said that she'd been researching women in conservation, and I was actually the only one she could find who had not got divorced, was still married and had twins. And so that threw my sisterhood theory straight out the window, because I was no longer part of a sisterhood. I was one of one. Yeah. but it was, it kept me sane at the time. But I have actually found subsequently a second in the world who has twins who's in conservation. So I am now one of two, which makes me feel better.
Well, cool. That's nice. And when you moved to the park in 2007, actually you replaced a young South African couple called Hugo and Elsabe van der Westhuizen, who were in charge of the park from 1997 to 2006. And I'm wondering, what was the situation of wildlife populations of rhinos, elephants, and lions back in 2007?
Yeah, it was at not at the beginning, that's unfair to say, but the rhino reintroduction program had not yet been completed. That took place between 2003 and 2010. So there was still a few years left to bring in the final members of the founder population that we reintroduced here. So the rhinos was still an ongoing developing program. Elephants obviously take a huge amount of time to recover from serious poaching and the decimation that they'd undergone through the 1970s and 80s. And actually we feel, even now, 15 years later, that there's really been a change over the last 5 years. We've really seen breeding herds properly start to settle down. We've started to see bigger numbers, and just the way that they interact when you drive past or when you are close to them. There's been a real change, and particularly, quite interestingly, even more so over the last couple of years with COVID, with much less tourism in the park. So far fewer vehicles, far fewer people, and they've really seemed to have changed. And many years ago, my husband Ed was a safari guide in the park before we joined the conservation side of things, and he recalls never seeing an elephant upstream of the camp that he was working in. And now he flies the project plane for aerial surveillance most days, and he comes back, before breakfast, and he says, "I've seen 1,000 elephant this morning." So there's been a real change in those sorts of those big herbivores, their populations. Lions have always been quite good here, because although there is hunting and there's pressure on the outside of the park, we have a perennial river that runs through the middle of the park. So the lions are concentrated, some of the population of the lions are concentrated around that river, because there's always prey for them to hunt. And then wild dogs have really bounced back as well. Wild dogs have had a real recovery over the last, certainly the last decade, and that's really improved. So everything comes back in its own time. If it feels threatened and it feels under threat, and there's potential for vulnerability, we find that wildlife just disappears. But it doesn't disappear in as much as it's being killed. It goes into little refuges. It finds little islands of safety, and when that pressure, that threat has been released, they just pop out again, out of nowhere, and suddenly you're like, well, hang on a second, I didn't think we had those, or we haven't had so many of those, but they've probably been there all the time. They just have been, in these little refuges, hiding, waiting for things to get better. They're very clever.
You mentioned the reintroduction of black rhinos. I would like to highlight that the North Luangwa Park was home to Africa's largest population of South Central black rhinos, but due to the devastating poaching pressure, the rhinos were wiped out completely, and in 1998 they were declared extinct. And you also mentioned that they were re-established in 4 phases between 2003 and 2010. So can you tell us a bit more about the reintroduction? It sounds very interesting, and obviously it worked, so I'm interested.
Yeah, so just small point of correction, but Zambia had the 3rd largest population of black rhinos on the continent in the 1970s, and that was across the whole country, not just this here in the park or in the Luangwa Valley, of which we're part. And then there was estimated between 2,000 and 4,000 in the whole valley. So I'm sure many people have heard of South Luangwa. We're North Luangwa. There's other parks along the length of the Luangwa River as well. And then this park, there was an estimated, although never accurately counted, between 500 and 2,000, which is still an impressive number. And as you said, they were wholeheartedly slaughtered, and by 1998 they were declared nationally extinct. By which time Frankfurt was a partner here in North Luangwa, and it had been that stronghold for black rhinos. And when the law enforcement, with Hugo and Elspie, as you've mentioned, when they were managers, they began reinforcing the law enforcement, basically upholding the law, and making sure that people that were poaching would be arrested, and that there would be, justice would be followed. So the next natural step would be to restore a mega herbivore like the black rhino, because they're like the bulldozers and the excavators and the backhoes of the natural world. They push things over, they dig things up, in the same way that elephants do. They live in bushes, they open up pathways through thick undergrowth, so they're very important as machinists, really, for the ecosystem. So bringing them back was quite important. And it's a kind of natural next step in the evolution of conservation, if you like. What do? Do you just keep on protecting stuff, or do you start, putting really interesting stuff in there, like black rhinos? And the principle being that if you can get your standards to a point that you can protect something like black rhinos, then everything else will benefit, because it takes so much effort. It takes so many resources, manpower, and very high standards to keep them safe and to monitor them and look after them properly. That you can then, everything else will fall under that and be fine too. So that was the sort of natural next step. So Hugo and Elspie set about putting that forward, getting the right permissions, putting together the agreements, getting all the assessments, was there enough food, where would we put them, how could we manage them, all of those kinds of things. And that was a 2-3 year process. They had to recruit more manpower just to secure them and look after them and monitor them. Building fences, we've got a very small, but containing them, the fence was built to contain them to begin with, so that they didn't arrive, the rhinos didn't arrive here and then just bombshell and go off in a million different directions. The idea was to sort of contain them and get them to settle down and then be soft release thereafter. So yeah, just huge amounts of infrastructure and jobs and training and equipment and everything you can think of. The rhinos were all donated from a variety of agencies in South Africa, and with government agreement between South Africa and Zambia, and we were the sort of facilitators of that, along with South African national parks and other rhino management agencies and groups. All brought everybody together and got the agreements on the table, and then it was a case of raising the money to get them here. Although every single animal was donated for zero cash, they were all donated for free. It's a huge amount to fly 5 rhinos here at a time. We can't bring them in planes bigger than we use a C-130 and Hercules, and you can get 5 rhinos in each one. So we introduced 25 rhinos over 10 years, and having to hire a plane every time, and building bomas and getting in feed, because they have to be weaned off their feed in South Africa, weaned onto our feed, and you do feed them in between times with some easy stuff like lucerne and pellets and things.
I'd like to thank the Frankfurt Zoological Society, Institute for Humane Education, and the Population Media Center for supporting my podcast through their social media and newsletter. Thank you. And how many rhinos are there now? You said there were 25. So are they breeding successfully?
Yeah, they are breeding successfully. We've definitely increased our numbers. We are now officially a Key 2 population, which is between 50 and 100 individuals. We don't discuss absolute numbers, only just from a security perspective. I'm not trying to be coy or shy or anything, but it's a decision that we made at the African Rhino Specialist Group with all the range states a few years ago, that by declaring, and actually Zambia was the example, by declaring a national total, it would reveal the park total for North Luangwa. So it was determined then that the African Rhino Specialist Group would only release continental numbers, so that it would spread the security risk. And that's exactly what we've stuck to since then. So we don't discuss absolute numbers, unfortunately, but they're doing very well. We have one of the fastest growth rates on the continent. We've got lots of babies, we've got lots of females, we've got lots of young boys coming through and pushing out and trying to fight with the dominant bulls. So that's always quite interesting to see what happens year on year.
So I'm not sure whether I overheard it, but you said, I know that you cannot say the exact number, but you said somewhere between 50 and 100?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, all right. And you don't mention these numbers because you're afraid that if you mention them, then the poachers would come again and kill the rhinos?
Yeah, well, we try to emphasise our enforcement capability and how we are, we've got well-trained rangers, we've got the dog unit, we've got the aircraft, we've got a multitude of tools with which we can uphold the law and combat poaching, particularly ivory poaching and rhino horn poaching. So once you start throwing numbers around, it's quite easy to determine what our vulnerability is. Because you can say, okay, well, if we had 1,000 rhinos and 12 scouts, you'd work out pretty quickly that we'd be vulnerable. So we try to sort of just not, be general about things, so that vulnerability is a little less obvious. Yeah. Okay.
So regarding the rhinos, you said that there used to be between 500 and 2,000 in the 1970s, and now you have roughly 100 rhinos. So how many rhinos would you like to have in the park?
Good question. We actually realized that you can't just keep having more and more rhinos, and therefore you have to keep adding more and more enforcement and more resources and more money to keep it all together, and that's unfortunately not very sustainable for any of us, nor our stress levels. So we are continuously looking to the next steps and what we can do to spread our risk as well, spread our vulnerability, spread our risk. So a few years ago, 2018, we actually looked as an organisation to expand in Zambia to Nsumbu National Park on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, which had historically a black rhino population. So we've been working there for the last 3 years to try to secure the area. And again, basically what we did here 20 years ago is, build the area up so it gets secure, it has the buy-in from the communities, it's got all the infrastructure and the law enforcement in place so that they could then take the next founder population, so we can start populating other areas in Zambia. So that's the goal. And then we also have these young bulls that like to throw their weight around, and they also like to disappear because what they tend to do is they get to about 7 or 8, 9 years old, and then they disappear for a few months. Not disappear completely, we know where they are, but they're in vulnerable areas. They go into edges of the area that they're living in, and so they become a little more difficult for us to find and difficult for us to secure them. And then often they'll come back and they look like Arnold Schwarzenegger in rhino form, and they've put on lots of weight and they've built up their testosterone, and then they come back and they start bullying the dominant bulls again. But some of them can decide to go a little bit further than we feel comfortable with. And so we're actually looking at the moment of drawing up a roadmap for doing a community rhino conservancy, which would be the first of its kind in the country, to do something with these young bulls. We're looking to expand the tourism base for the whole area, and particularly for that to benefit the communities. So we're trying to navigate our way through that at the moment, and it's just an idea form, trying to work out what would be the next best steps. So we've always conscious of the population increasing. What's next? You've got to be 5 to 10 years ahead of the curveball on that, otherwise you're going to end up with a lot of rhinos, and when they get into a point where they're socially or nutritionally compressed, the population growth rate can start to decline very quickly. So they're not very clever. They will beat each other up, and we don't need that. So we're always thinking of the next steps.
Okay, it would be interesting to follow up on this in a couple of years. Another iconic animal in the park are elephants. And I read on the website that in 1960 the park held about 70,000 elephants, but due to the illegal poaching driven by ivory boom in Asia, the population had been hunted almost to elimination by the 1980s. But now, 30 years later, the North Park is home to Zambia's largest, fastest growing and densest population of elephants. So how many elephants live in the park, if it's not a secret?
That one's not. I mean, actually, you cited the 1960s. I've got a report from the FAO, a Corley report from 1973, and the Luangwa Valley, so over a greater ecosystem size, the Luangwa Valley had the highest population of surveyed. Now, there's a big caveat in surveyed, because obviously there were other areas that hadn't been surveyed. It was the highest population of surveyed elephants on the continent, which is staggering. It was 100,000 plus counted, which does make me blink several times. I can't even imagine that number now. Yes, they were completely decimated, down to 10,000, across the whole valley, completely wiped out. Here in North Park, it got as low as 500, it's believed. We're now over 5,000, and we feel that there's been an immigration as well as being safe and they've bred up. We also feel that there's been an immigration of elephant too, and I think that goes back to what I said almost a bit earlier about, they'll find a refuge where they feel safe, and I think North Luangwa has become a bit like that. North Luangwa is a safe refuge for them, and they can talk over big distances with their rumbles and through their feet. So I'm sure everyone's heard about us and they come up here. But I think I definitely feel that, like I said, Ed, when he was safari guiding, he wouldn't see elephant, and would only see them downstream and only saw them a couple of times. Now it's impossible to move without seeing them. So it's it's been an incredible bounce back. But with that comes the human wildlife interaction with the communities. They roam over large distances. The park is not fenced, and the communities living outside the park are vulnerable to that, depending on where they put their fields or their houses or whatever it might be. So there's a price to pay for successful conservation, and that's then also looking after the communities that live alongside that wildlife and making sure that they're not negatively impacted by that.
We'll definitely talk about that, but now I'd just like to ask a few more questions about the elephant. So why is it the only increasing population in Zambia? What's happening in other parks?
Good question. I think history's on our side with this one. The North Luangwa Conservation Programme is officially the partnership between the Frankfurt Zoological Society and the Zambian Department of National Parks and Wildlife. And alongside that, with the community resource boards, and those are entities that are developed with the community or in the communities in the areas around the national park. So they're community-based committees. Committees, I suppose is the right word. A board, and they're elected by the residents, and they have the mandate for wildlife within their areas, alongside the Department of National Parks and Wildlife. And in North Luangwa, we've worked the three entities, the national parks, the CRBs, and Frankfurt, have worked hand in hand and alongside each other for 30 plus years. We don't make any distinction between a gazetted government-paid wildlife police officer or a community resource board trained and equipped village game scout. We pay for the training, the equipment, the mobility, the rations and everything that's needed for all of those rangers, I guess you can call them, as a collective. And we work hand in hand and side by side, and it's just a very unified front, I guess, as a team. Elsewhere in Zambia, there's a little less cohesion in that, and that's not to detract in any way from the organisations that are working in those other areas, but they have parallel, much more integrated over the last few years, but they've always been parallel organisations. So DMPW have been doing their own thing, National Parks have been doing their own thing, and alongside that have been these NGOs, local NGOs working with the community resource boards and the village game scouts. And that has not always been a very integrated approach. And I just think a lot of that goes back to actually having the rhinos. With the rhinos, you can apply to and you can get additional funding, which is specifically targeted at rhinos. And because of that, we've been able to upscale very quickly based off those rhinos. And that goes again back to what I was saying, that once you get them, you can then hang all this other fruit off their tree, if you like. If you can look after rhinos, you can look after everything else. And so the elephants have definitely benefited from the protection that has been put in place because of the rhinos. We actually have a unit now we call the Rhino and Elephant Protection Unit, because we put them sort of alongside each other and realise, they're both equally as important. They always have been, but you really do step it up for rhinos, and I think the elephants have benefited. So, yeah, I can't speak for the other organisations on their successes or failures, but I do feel that our integrated approach and the fact that we've been well resourced over the years has been in our favour.
You mentioned the Rhino and Elephant Protection Unit. I wanted to talk about this unit and some other strategies that you've been implementing in the past. So can you name out a few of the strategies that helped eliminate poaching and explain why they are important?
Yeah, I think, the sort of first one and the basis of everything is just foot coverage, anti-poaching patrols all over the ecosystem. So we cover the national park, which is 4,500 square kilometres, and then the game management areas beyond that, which is 22,000 square k's in total, so another 18,000 or so square kilometres. So it's an enormous area, and being British, I can equate that to about the size of Wales. So it's vast, and not very many roads within that. So it is purely down to foot coverage. We've got 36, I think it is now, what we call camps. So they're basically a base from which these wildlife police officers and village game scouts, these rangers, from where they are based, and they will be associated to a certain camp. So for example, we've got Chifunda camp, and they've got wildlife police officers there, they've got village game scouts there, and then they will form teams that will go off and do anti-poaching patrols. They will do investigations, they'll do follow-up patrols, they'll do day patrols, short patrols. A general patrol is a long patrol, 7 to 10 days, for 4 people, and they'll take everything with them, their sleeping stuff, or their food, or their water, or they'll pick up water along the way. And so it's just coverage, it's just getting people out and about on the ground, and that is the basis upon which so much is built. But then on top of that, we have these specialised units. So the Rhino and Elephant Protection Unit is a group of better trained, better skilled, I guess is probably a better word. They have shorter, more intense operations, very targeted, very specific, and often generally intelligence based, as are the canine unit. We've got 7 dogs and multiple handlers, and working over even beyond the area. We're going into different urban areas and to borders, and towns with the dog unit. We've got the plane, we've got community conservation and education initiatives. So it's huge, it's far-reaching, and hopefully very broad and holistic, and brings in everybody. We're trying not to exclude anyone. Obviously jobs is a really big one. We're the biggest employer in the area. So yeah, lots of things.
We're going to talk about the work with community, but I'm just wondering, how many rangers do you have to patrol this whole huge area that's the size of Wales, and whether it happens on a daily basis that they meet a poacher, and what do they do when they meet one?
So we've got about 440 active officers, and as I said, they form up into 4-man teams, and at any one time we'll probably have anywhere between 10 and 15 units will be out on patrol at any one time. So they'll go out on patrol, and then they'll come back in, they'll be debriefed. They have some rest days, and then they'll be back on standby, so they can be called up to be redeployed any time after that. So yeah, there's a rotation of people moving out and about on different rotations all the time and deployments. And then the plane, I think, is a really important tool for surveillance, just general surveillance of the whole area. Ed flies the plane, he flies most days. And supports those teams on the ground, from whether it's, gunshots have been reported, for example, and he can fly immediately to go and to respond to that. Fires at this time of year are often poacher related, because it's quite easy to track, because the ground is very dusty. Poachers particularly on their exit, if they've managed to get into the park, particularly on their exit, will set a fire to distract and deter anybody from tracking them and following them. So Ed can fly for, check on fires and things like that. So, yeah, I think I actually did the stats the other day. They're encountering a poacher or an illegal activity. So an illegal activity might be just footprints or evidence of, rather than actually encountering people. About 1 in every 5 patrols will pick something up. So 4 of those 5 are literally covering the ground in hope they don't find anything, but they are actively trying to find things. So yeah, 1 in 5 roughly will find something, and that's not always an arrest. That's not always a full contact or anything like that. And so yeah, when poachers are encountered, their official title, and they're mandated, even the village game sets, is as wildlife police officers. So the clues in the title, they are police officers for wildlife. So it's pretty much the same mandate as a policeman. They have the powers of arrest. I suppose it's easy to imagine it like that. They will tell somebody to stand down and, stand still, you're under arrest. And then if the person resists arrest, then obviously it's a sort of similar thing to how you can imagine a policeman would handle it. It's very rare here in Zambia for our officers to be fired upon or to have to return fire. It's definitely the exception rather than the rule here. And I know that's not true in many other places that have much more risky poachers, but our poachers, I guess, are bit more. They behave a bit better, I guess.
Yeah, for example, I did an interview with a guy who founded an organization to save elephants in Central Africa and Senegal, and it's really tough out there, especially in Chad. So the conditions are much harder. You said while we were doing the pre-interview that conservation is not so much about managing nature and all these populations of animals as it is about people. And it's true that there can be no successful conservation without the support and participation of local communities. You've already mentioned that earlier. And you do a lot of activities. I mean, you help people find alternative livelihoods. You created a community conservation bank. There is a beekeeping initiative. You're developing 2 community forests. You do conservation education. So Which of these initiatives bring the most results, or which of them are the most effective?
Yeah, it's really hard. Yeah, really. You know, when I entered conservation, I thought, oh, lots of wildlife, that'd be great. And then realised very quickly it's lots of admin and it's all around people. And yeah, as I said when we spoke before, it's very much a case of wildlife just does its own thing. It really doesn't need us. And in fact, if we didn't exist, it would be absolutely fine. It's all about people. It's all about managing our staff as much as and the rangers and the wildlife police officers and the village game scouts. It's all about man management as much as it is as integrating and engaging with other stakeholders in the ecosystem, mostly the communities. And that includes also things like local government and district officials and things like that. But generally, our engagement is with local communities and trying to help them live alongside wildlife. Zambia rural communities are very poor. Farming is practically impossible. The climate's extremely harsh. We're in the peak of our hot dry season at the moment. Today hit 51 degrees. How anything can, and it hasn't rained since April, so how anything can possibly grow at this time of year is you know, it just doesn't. So enabling people to have a livelihood beyond the very short growing season for subsistence farming, enabling them to be able to have a skill that they can use for the rest of the year, or they can have savings that they can use for the rest of the year, or beekeeping, or the community conservation banks of people who have done a bit of goat rearing, become a tailor. You know, there's all sorts of little initiatives that doesn't rely on the weather and doesn't rely on wildlife. So yeah, we're just trying to. I'm not sure I can pick any one that's working the best, but we're trying a lot of different things that the communities themselves have identified. We're not just throwing stuff out there and hoping something sticks. We're engaging with the communities and working out with them what they would like and how they would like to manage their resources and how they would like to live alongside wildlife freely and successfully and happily and without fear. So we're trying to improve that. That's our goal.
So maybe I was supposed to ask a different question. Which of the activities do the local communities appreciate the most?
Good question. They love. I mean, the conservation education program is sort of universally loved. We've been doing that for the last 20 years. The schools love it. The kids love it. Yeah, it's a really tough one to implement, but it's very rewarding, as most things are with kids. So yeah, it's very much a case of trying to put things out there that people want and that they will engage with. And the community conservation education program has definitely, I think it's one of those things, if you went into a community and asked them, you know, what do you know about conservation? Pretty much everybody's gone through our teaching program and awareness program and has got some level of understanding now of what conservation is all about. But the next challenge along that pathway is to get people to change their attitudes and change their behaviour. It's quite easy to change knowledge, but then changing attitudes and behaviours is another step.
Speaking of the attitudes of local people and the cooperation between you and them, while doing research for this interview, I read a long article that was written for the New Yorker magazine about the history of the park. It focused on Delia and Mark Owens, who worked in the park from 1986 till 1996. And they did great work by reducing the illegal poaching, but they were accused of using some violent means. And after the ABC News aired a documentary, Deadly Game, in which a ranger killed a poacher, they were supposed to be investigated and they never returned to Zambia again, and then they were replaced by another family who took charge of the park. And I'm just wondering whether they didn't break the trust between the local community, or whether their behavior didn't break the trust, or what was it like for the other family, the Westhuizen, to follow up on their work?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably a really good question for them, to be honest. But from our perspective, coming in here, Frankfurt was always a donor and then was the implementing partner, and with a long history for the area. And the Zambian people are incredibly dignified and humble, and far from lacking in common sense. There's although education might not be the best in the world, particularly in rural areas, they're very dignified and respectful population of people. And I think they're very good at understanding and divorcing the good from the bad and the right from the wrong, and they understand that people, people speak through their actions. So Hugo and Elsaby put down the marker, and hopefully Ed and I have carried that forward. Mark and Delia were here for a long time. They did some amazing things. They did some funny things. But I'm sure mine and Ed's legacy would also have, a few, why did they do that? Not in the same way that others have done previously, but everyone's got their own legacy, and hopefully the mark has been set down, and we have goodwill with the communities, and there is a lot of water under the bridge, and we work very hand in hand with our communities and with the authorities, and open and transparent, and making sure that people understand the reasons for things, and why we approach anti-poaching and the enforcement. All we're trying to do is uphold the law here, and then alongside that is make sure that people can live alongside and benefit from wildlife in a legal and proper way. So it's very much history's history. I think it's best left there.
I'm sure that your legacy will be great, and you are, out of the three families, you've stayed in the park for the longest time, right? 13 years. And so how long are you planning to work in the park?
That was not the intent at all when we first got here, but it is kind of the dream job as well. Ed grew up in Zambia when he was a kid, and remembers seeing rhinos in South Luangwa when he went on game drives as a boy. So to get this job here now is, we're stuffed. We can't go anywhere else really, because it's like the final, it's like the top of the mountain. I don't know. We said when we first got here we would get the rhinos in and then move on, and then we did that, and then we said, okay, we'll get something else set up, and then we'll leave, and then we did that, and we're still here. And now it's getting the community side of things and the next founder population of rhinos out of here, and who knows. It gets me back 20, 30 years, I'll still be sitting in the same chair doing the same interview.
Maybe you'll have windows, maybe not.
Got windows, I just have glass.
Okay. Yeah, I know, I meant the glass, of course. Claire, it's been wonderful talking to you. Good luck with your work, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
You can find out more about the North Luangwa National Park on the website northluangwa.org. I'll spell it out because it's difficult. northluangwa.org, and follow their work on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Thanks so much for listening to Nature Solutionaries. You can subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or Stitcher. And if you like this episode, I would be really grateful if you could write a review or share the podcast on your social media. This will help other people find the show. For more podcasts, you can visit my website veronicaperkova.com/podcast. I'm Veronica Perkova, and I look forward to talking to you soon.